Hello, my name is Ildiko,
And I'm Phil.
and this is the My Open Source Experience podcast, where we discuss all the things about the mechanics of open source in business and in communities. Follow the podcast on your favorite platform and check out the latest episode on Season 3. On today's episode, we have Stormy Peters with us, and she has a very extensive career and a lot of experience with different companies as well as nonprofit organizations to work on open source. So today we will explore open source a little bit from a corporate structure and company perspective to see how companies approach open source communities and projects in the sense of getting involved and investing in those projects. But before we dive into today's topic, Stormy, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself, your tech background, and what do you do currently?
So thanks very much for having me. I'm super excited to be talking to all of you. So my name's Stormy Peters. A little bit about myself. I worked in open source for a long time. I originally got started because in college, actually, I thought it was ridiculous that all of us were writing the same code to solve the same problem for the same assignment, and really didn't like all that duplication of effort. So open source was a great fit when it came around, a way to collaborate and work together and make the world a better place and build on the work of others. So I've spent the last couple decades helping people work in open source software, helping nonprofits, helping companies, and figuring out and helping the projects themselves figuring out how to work together better. I think it's a fascinating way of working and making the world a better place. Right now, I'm doing keynote speaking and consulting. I really want to help this way of collaborative working reach other industries. So that's where I would like to focus on things like climate change and health. And I live in Colorado, where it's nice and sunny right now, even though it's supposed to snow.
Before we dive into how your career journey has been with open source and what your experience was, do you remember when you first learned about the concept of open source?
Yeah, so I first got involved in open source when I was at Hewlett Packard. First heard about it. I was managing the CDE team, which is the user interface for Unix. So I was in the Unix lab on the CDE team, and I had about 30 people working on CDE, and we weren't adding a lot of new features because technology had been around for a long time. So we were mostly just fixing bugs and making it work on new hardware and advancing things. And I went to a standards meeting and I discovered that all of the companies in the room had teams that were working on the exact same thing. And not only did we have our own separate code bases, but we would agree on which bugs we were going to fix first. Like we would have these meetings where we would vote on which bugs got fixed. And I thought, then we're all going to go back to our separate companies and, have our engineers all redo this work. So it was very much like my college experience of having people all work on the same projects and write their own individual solutions to it. And it just felt like a waste of effort. That was at the time that Linux was first starting to come out, and come out in a big way that lots of people were using it. And there was not just one user interface. So we had CD on HPUX on all the Unixes, but on Linux they had GNOME and KDE, so they even had competing solutions to it. And I thought, why can't we work with them? Like they know how to work in the open. Why can't we just use that? So that was my first experience with open source software.
It sounds like that your main drive to keep exploring open source was this opportunity to reduce duplicative effort, like kind of industry wide.
It wasn't just to reduce waste. It was like to inspire all the other things we could be doing. Like if you're fixing the same bug somebody else is, that means both of you are not doing, you haven't gotten to the part that you really wanted to do, right? You're taking care of like the basics. So I really wanted to see what we could build together if we work together on it, as opposed to each of us individually having to get there.
When did you first get involved with open source? Like after learning about what the concept was?
So this was around the year 2000, wasn't 2000, somewhere in that time frame. And I met with Helix Code, which then became Zimian, which then got acquired by SUSE. Um, they were the primary drivers behind the GNOME project, and so that was my first experience. I actually remember meeting with Nat Friedman in a restaurant where he had those Blackberries that had little keyboards, and the whole time he was talking to us, he was also like keying in text messages, or they were emails because we didn't really have text messages then, emails to other people. Um, and then I went out to visit them, and I was in my 20s, and I came back and told my manager I think I was the oldest person there. Um, so it's a very young, very new effort to bring this open source into the commercial space. And then I went to Guadec in Copenhagen. That was my very first open source conference to go to. It was still relatively small. The experience I really remember was walking in the door, and as I walked in the door, there was like just a table that you signed in at with one person behind the table. And when I told her my name, she was like, "You're a girl." And she had been trying to decide based on my name whether I was a woman or a man, and there weren't a lot of women in the field at the time. I think a lot of women at that conference was the marketing team from Helix Code. Um, and then I also had an embarrassing moment. I was sitting, it was a one room conference, maybe, I don't know, 100 people. I actually don't know what the size was. And I had this really cute HP laptop. They don't make them anymore. It was much smaller than any laptop we have now. It was an HP 800. But it was running Windows. And of course, it made the Windows boot up sound in the middle of the conference.
Yes, that can be embarrassing indeed, particularly back then.
Yes, yes. But I couldn't get the modem drivers to run on Linux, and I needed to be able to dial in for work.
And Stormy, you were my introduction into open source.
Oh, was I?
Right. So, yes, Stormy and I were on a roller hockey team together. And I was in need for a job because the .com I had been working for had recently imploded. And so, yes, through that connection, she actually introduced me to an opportunity that was in the Linux and open source lab, the fledgling Linux and open source lab at Hewlett Packard in 2001.
That's pretty cool.
And we got to work together.
Mm-hmm.
I can only share the experience of stepping into a room where people look at me like, "Oh, you're a girl," because they were telling me the same thing, that they saw the name in the emails and they were like, "This looks like I don't know, in some language, I think my first name resembles more. I think that's more like a name that they give to men as opposed to women," and so they were surprised, and I'm like, "Yep, I'm a girl."
Well,
So
a lot of the Latin languages probably assume an O at the end is yeah, masculine.
you worked in leadership roles in various companies throughout the years, and in HP you were part of, I think, forming their open source program office. Were you working with open source prior to that step, or was that experience also part of your learning journey about open source still?
I created first the open source review board at HP because I wanted to bring GNOME onto HPUX. So I told you how I wanted to use GNOME, this open source user interface, instead of CDE. And it turns out it wasn't, I mean, it was a hard technical problem, but not an impossible technical problem. We had Helix Code and others to help us port it over to HPUX. But it turns out it was I'd say a legal concern for the company to make sure that as we introduced this open source code with this license that was very unknown at the time, that we didn't accidentally copy left HPUX or, I don't want to say endanger our customers, but, do something unexpected to our customers as well. So in trying to solve that problem and convince people that what we were, making sure we had adequate legal review, got to work with Scott Peterson, who was awesome. He was legal at HP. And trying to get all the right reviews and all the right people together, I ended up creating the open source review board, which then did that for a lot of other groups within HP, so we could make sure that we were using open source appropriately. And everyone was super excited at the time to work on it. Like, so Scott Peterson, the attorney, was like, this is fascinating. Like, this stuff has not never got had case law. Like, I mean, he just loved it. The IT group agreed to build us a custom tool with, I mean, not now it might seem simple, but at the time it was a web base where you could like say who had reviewed it and who had approved it and have comments and systems. And everyone that touched it really enjoyed working on it because it was something brand new.
Was this more focusing on licenses or other aspects of open source as well?
In the very beginning, the main focus was licenses, I would say, for most companies. There was kind of this concern that copyleft licenses might do unexpected things. And then on the other side, there was this concern that copyleft, making sure that copyleft was strong enough to actually accomplish what they wanted in open source. And so there was a lot of debate about what the licenses meant. And then we had a lot of proliferation of like random licenses, like now pretty much people pick MIT or Apache or GPL, but back then people wrote their own licenses because none of them were written by attorneys. So we had like the beer license where the license said, if you see me at a conference, please buy me a beer. And we weren't allowed to use that one because our attorneys said we might not recognize the guy at a conference. And so we might not comply with the license.
Oh, wow.
But I would say, Stormy, the proliferation is back on now, right? I mean, it's not altered open source licenses. We have all the business source licenses, and that new variant that is for the same reason, right? I mean, it was back then. It was the same reason. Organizations, fresh little companies, were trying to figure out how to get some kind of leverage or priority for their organization and some code base that they were responsible for. And so there was the attribution license where you had to make sure that in whatever you were doing, you were going to give attribution to that company. And they all ultimately failed the open source sniff test from the OSI. And so that set of licenses was able to stay concise and compact.
I actually think the main problem is that we're using copyright law for software. Like I actually went to the UC Boulder and took Jason Hazelmeyer's copyright law class just because I wanted to understand it better. And I don't think I don't know if there's a better tool, but it's not quite a perfect tool for software.
It's getting even worse for AI. So we're in a really weird place now.
Yeah, it just doesn't fit AI at all, right? Like, I mean,
Yeah, this is kind of becoming a recurring topic on this podcast with our conversations. I think you're, I don't know, the at least the third person who we talked to recently ish who mentions that copyright law and software is not a great match. And then yeah, sometimes we move forward and then scratch our heads on the AI related things, and we'll see where everything goes from here.
maybe you'll have to interview one of our famous open source expert attorneys and ask them, is there something else we should have created in the beginning?
We shall do that. I would like to dive just a little bit into the formation and how the OSPO worked. Like you mentioned, the review board to look into open source licenses and relevant things. How did that, was that the group that evolved into the open source program office, or was it something else that triggered the creation of that specific group within the company?
I don't actually have a memory of OSRB turning into OSPO. Um,
It came a little bit later, I think. I think that was something that I did after you had left.
that would be why I have no memory of it.
But it was very much standing on your shoulders of what was created with the open source review process and the program managers. I extended it and we started doing more tools. We started doing more training. And at that point, the term had started to begin to exist in the ecosystem. There weren't very many organizations calling something an open source program office, but it did exist. And that seemed like a good name. And so I liked it and I started to use it.
I think Sun was first.
Yeah, yeah, I can believe that.
And then there's a debate over whether it should be open source open source program office or open source programs office, um, which I decided is not a fight at all worth fighting.
No.
I often refer to the open source review board as HP's OSPO. So that
Yeah, if you look at both of our resumes, we both created open source program office, and I think that's totally fair. I got no problem with that because the concept is the same. What's in a name, you know?
How much were you involved in building processes and spreading them around the company? Like, we talked about the license part, but when it comes to things like that social norm and getting involved upstream, how much was that part of that group's work?
I would say everybody that was on the review board was an expert in open source, and so it probably helped out greatly. Like whenever asked, we didn't have people whose job it was to go help teams. Sounds like that came later though, to help teams um, learn how to contribute upstream. But it was the group of experts, along with other pockets within the company, that would get called on. So we would often go make presentations to the other divisions, and we created a lot of like webinar type videos. We had blog posts internally. So we had a lot of educational materials, but we didn't act as consultants as far as like going out and embedding in a team and helping them.
Right. But I mean, you did with Bruce Perrins author the open source policy guide, right? And
Yes.
that was our that was the education. That was the thing that the lawyers said that the teams had to follow. And so that was what made the process relevant. And so understanding what open source you had, being able to document that, um, taking that list and having it reviewed by the open source review board, those were part of the policy steps that were uh, the culture that was initiated and with Stormy and that open source review board.
And when we acquired new companies, I would go out and meet with them, learn how they were using open source, and explain to them our policy, and see where we needed to figure it out.
Yeah, and that evolved into full due diligence activities. Right? We use tools to scan all of the existing code of an inbound company and understand what open source they're using and what licenses and was that actual compliance or not, and what's their vulnerability posture and so forth. Starting with I did a few smaller ones, but Palm was the biggest one I did for HP, and then I did Vonages for Ericsson. So large company acquisitions with lots of open source in their code bases.
That software to look for it. I mean, other companies grew around that space. So Black Duck and Palamita came out that scanned code. But before they were around, HP created Fossology, the software that became Fossology, an open source software project. So folks like Glenn Foster and Bob Gobile worked on it. And it was homegrown because we wanted to know what open source software we might be using that we didn't know about.
Well, there wasn't anything. Black Duck didn't exist at the
No, it
time.
was before Black Duck. Yeah.
Yeah. That was a conversation that me and Scott Peterson had. We were wondering, gee, it sure would be nice to have a tool that would hunt down licenses in the code so we know. And then I actually had Glenn Foster and the QA team at HP at the same time. And so my next meeting was with Glenn. And I said, you know what Scott and I were just talking about? And then Glenn went home over a weekend and came back on Monday and said, here's a tool. And it wasn't great, but it did a reasonable job. And he spent the next several years actually honing it. So that was the origin of Fossology.
When it comes to the review board and its activities, like, we talk to some extent about the business strategy around open source. Like, did the review board have any influence in terms of open source strategy that HP was taking, or was it company strategy that the review board took in and then built the processes and materials based off of?
So although there was a huge effort when Carly was CEO make sure that there was a trickle down effect and we all knew exactly what the strategy is and what we were all working on. I'm not sure there was like one software strategy for a company that size. But I would say that the open source policies that the review board set very much influenced what you could and couldn't do. And I think they were both informed about each other.
And what we were doing some stuff around inner source, and that was a time when that term started to come into existence as well. That was right when we were doing we started, and that was a cultural thing as well. The printer guys in particular were one that we
Oh,
really worked
yes.
with. Do you remember that?
Yes. I still have I still have the mug from that project. I didn't think of that as inner source actually. The trickiest part of the problem was they were including open source, and I assume there was an inner source concept, but they were including it because they wanted to share these components and they needed some way of tracking the software. And the printing department was primarily a hardware company. And so they wanted to give part numbers to these open source software projects so that they could track them. So it was really kind of fascinating from a process perspective.
Yeah, and that continued to evolve so that those internal product numbers became, a core set of functions that ran across multiple different product and printer lines, which was where the inner source piece came from. They were kind of a natural, because that was just part of the printer engine, right? And so that was a natural way of doing inner source across different product teams.
Still one of the keys to the success of a group like an OSPO is efficiency. So making sure that there is not a huge overhead introduced into the development process within the company, and having deadlines like that week that Stormy you mentioned are key for, I assume, reassure people that once they enter the process, they will not be held up forever on it, and it will not be hanging on a team that is not part of their specific engineering organization.
Yes. And I think if we get into how OSPOs have evolved, I think there's a lot they've obviously changed and there's a wide variety of OSPOs now. And so I've been to several talks and had several conversations with people on what are OSPOs now. And at a very simple level, some people are like, well, some OSPOs are compliance related and some are sort of, outreach and education related. Nithya, she's at Amazon now, was at Comcast, talked about young OSPOs and old OSPOs, meaning old OSPOs are more experienced, the company is more experienced with open source and they've been using it for a while and they have all their policies and processes in place. They focus on something different than a young OSPO, which is like, oh my gosh, we're using open source software. Like, what are we using? What should we be doing? So there's the range of what an OSPO does has changed over time while becoming a more defined set of work.
Yeah, something that I've seen as maybe a little bit of a struggle is like the OSPO function, like where it is in terms of like headcount and budget. Not every company has the bandwidth and people to have like a full blown OSPO team. And sometimes I see people with a role of director of open source or something similar and being part of the marketing team. And that can be a huge disconnect in many regards. So when it comes to, the new OSPOs, I think it's something for companies to consider, like where they put the different roles within their company structure to make sure that those roles can reach the effect that is expected from them. And sometimes it really matters which department within the company you belong to.
Agreed. I think the problem is this cross-functional nature of an OSPO. So like the first open source review board at HP had someone from engineering, someone from legal department, someone from, just all these different functions. Nowadays you're going to include, legal and some kind of business strategy and some kind of engineering process and probably some kind of marketing thing because what you say matters. And, by the time you then where does it go, right?
Yeah, and I've seen them often get pushed down a bit, right? They're sometimes too far down the organization to be able to have the broad exposure and influence across an organization, particularly a larger one. I've seen that happen a couple of times too, and to the detriment of what they're capable of getting done. Because then strategy is really tough, right? And strategy should be a piece of the OSPO, because it's integral, right? Open source is integral to modern software development in so many ways.
And I think if the company has a CTO or an office of the CTO or a chief strategy officer, I think it fits really well in both of those.
Yeah, and that's ultimately where the HP one went, right? I took it from the server group to the CTO office, and then we ended up in legal, but it was still okay because the legal folks were pretty strategy oriented at the time. I can't speak for what it's like after I left, but that was working okay, and it was high enough. Again, we were still, we were level 2, right? If the CEO is level 0, then that team and I was sitting at level 2, so there was enough. I was high enough in the organization to be able to effectively touch everything.
And then I've heard, and I can't think of any examples of people proposing chief open source software officers, and I don't think that makes sense unless your company is like very software focused. Like I couldn't imagine like an automobile company having a chief open source officer, right? It should be embedded somewhere.
And I don't know. Cars are an awful lot of software these days. I like the title because then it does put more than just compliance, because I think too often open source program offices are associated with compliance. And
What's
there's
your
a big
title?
strategy piece. I actually head an entirely different set of companies. So we have an open source program office in Ericsson, but it's another level down, parallel or as a sister organization to me. I run a set of companies and I report to the CTO, that are focused on upstream activities.
Mhm.
But yeah, I get involved in. I'm pushing a variety of strategies for Ericsson associated with open source, and I consider that part of my role, just between my experience and where I sit in the organization.
I think that, like, back to the comment of automotive companies, like there are a few examples. Like I think Mercedes has an open source manifesto. I think I saw Porsche for as the last company who announced one.
For sure, automobile companies should use open source and have open source programs offices or whatever. I just meant to put it at like reporting to the CEO, someone just focused on the open source piece. I think you'd have to have good justification. That's what I meant.
Oh, no. And I think we're probably aligned. It's just a matter of the term. I think having the term is important, but I think it's still reporting to the CTO makes sense. Because, for example, I know a lot of companies where there is a chief security officer, and that chief security officer reports to either the chief operating officer or to the chief technology officer, right? So it's a
It was not the title I was objecting to. It was the
the placement in the org. No, I got you.
yes.
Yeah, I got you.
No, I also just wanted to point out that maybe it is the software eating the world, quote unquote, or really just how we all evolve. Like we can see similar patterns in different industry segments, like telecommunications, automotive. I think industrial automation is probably one of them too. How they go through their open source sort of transformation journey in a sense, because it is just relevant to all these industry segments, and you can see the same patterns repeating on trying to understand what open source really is, what the implications of the licenses are, why invest in any open source project in any shape or form, either through donations or getting involved and working upstream, and so forth and so forth. Hopefully all of the above kind of way. And you can see now automotive companies going through that journey, after watching I was involved in the telecom segment going through that journey. So I think it's important to talk about what kind of roles, how to structure the organization internally, because it will become relevant for all these industry segments at one point, probably sooner rather than later.
And the automotive industry is pretty far along, like especially I've met with a lot of the German automotive companies that they use a lot of open source. They're collaborating with each other across the industry, as well as working inside their company. I actually met one of the Mercedes open source guys at GitHub Universe, standing in line for a beer, and we had a great chat.
And I just met one actually at the Linux Foundation Member Summit, and I gleaned something. We had a session, and what came out of his talk was that they actually tied their OSPOs and their policies together in their supply chain. And I had not heard of that before, but that's brilliant. That makes so much sense, particularly for the automotive industry, where they have so many. Their physical supply chain is very, very deep. And being able to know that what you're getting from your supplier is under the same set of processes that you're using internally, so you can trust that what was consumed by them actually has gone through the same level of vetting and due diligence as to what you're using. I thought that was just brilliant, that they're sharing what those policies are, agreeing what they are up and down the supply chain, so stuff moves seamlessly when it comes to the open source that's in those components. I thought I hadn't heard of that before, and I thought that was just really cool.
We will be talking to someone from Mercedes. That's going to be exciting. Anyone in the audience, look out for that content if you're in the automotive industry or interested in the automotive industry angle of open source. But I love the thought of looking into the supply chain, because I think we mentioned that more and more as well. And in terms of structuring the work, I think the concept is probably applicable very well outside of the automotive segment, even if not everyone is having such deep supply chain challenges as,
with physical things too, right? That's why it was logical for them to start it, but I totally agree. There's going to be learnings to be leveraged.
Maybe we could connect them to the HP printer folks that have part numbers.
There you go.
The other thing is that I've been seeing, like, as the economy has its waves and companies are doing layoffs, like OSPOs are on the chopping block very often, or people who are working on open source. So even when you have a job within a company that includes working on open source as part of your job, it doesn't always feel like the most secure position. And then at the same time, we are facing the maintainer shortage in all open source projects out there. I don't have data. I should look into get some data about that. But it's definitely something that I personally hear left and right. And then you get the numbers of the 80-95% of all modern software depending on or containing open source or being open source software. So it's just, I think we are at the time when we need to figure this out, but it's really unclear what the best way of working or structure is for this. And I think there are probably also people who would be happy to maintain a project, but they don't necessarily want to work for a large company to do that. Like running the risk of being reassigned to other projects that they don't want to work on. So there are a lot of considerations on both the company side as well as the individual side when it comes to how to maintain the open source projects. And yes, talking about the bug fixing aspect rather than the new feature development aspect, which is still more, I think it's probably easier for companies to justify and figure out why to work on new features upstream versus the regular maintenance type of work, which is probably a little bit less tied to revenue.
I think on the maintenance type work, the best solutions I've seen are companies pooling together to hire people. So like putting money in the Linux Foundation to hire someone. Because why would one company, sometimes it's not even a full-time job, but why would one company bear that for all companies? I think is kind of the argument every company uses when it comes up. But on the OSPOs, I've been thinking about that quite a bit because I have a lot of friends that were affected and laid off because the OSPO was kind of shut down. And I think it goes back to the conversation we were having earlier on the whether it's new versus old OSPOs or OSPOs focused on compliance versus outreach or education. I think OSPOs evolve with their company, and I think sometimes the OSPO that you have is no longer the OSPO that you may need, or maybe you don't need an OSPO anymore. And there's still tons to do. My friends are like, but there's lots of work to do. There's still lots of work to do to help a company use open source. But I think it has evolved, and maybe management hasn't seen that evolution or doesn't understand. I don't know each individual case, but I think it has something to do with that evolution of what an OSPO does, and people seeing it as one thing and not the new thing. When I went, I actually hired Ashley Wolf to create GitHub's OSPO, but I argued quite fiercely before I did that GitHub did not need an OSPO. And I was finally told that everybody thought they did except for me, so please go do this anyway. So we did, but we focused the GitHub OSPO on creating tools for all OSPOs. So not just being GitHub's OSPO, but since GitHub already knew how to do open source, like how can we use the data that GitHub has and the knowledge that GitHub has to create tools for OSPOs. So it's a very different OSPO than you would find at, say a retail store who decided to create an OSPO because they discovered that they had open source software in their software.
So it sounds like what you're saying, that OSPO is not a concrete definition of what the group should look like within a particular company. It depends on a lot of factors, like where the company is with their open source journey and what the nature of what they are doing, operator versus vendor company. So it, like, when a company considers to create an open source program office, then they need to look into what their challenges are and what they would like to improve when it comes to approaching open source, as opposed to saying that OSPO is something like a template or a cookie cutter thing, and we need to have our OSPO just exactly how other companies structured theirs.
I think there are lots of templates you could copy, but there's not one single template for an OSPO. And I think if you run an OSPO, I think it's really important to see how you're evolving and to make sure your management chain's involved, and if the need is going away, to be able to recognize that. I don't know. There's no easy answer these days with layoffs and reorgs. I mean, it's a tumultuous time, but I do think OSPOs change over time.
No, and I think our conversation today has really hit upon a variety of different aspects that an OSPO can and should be responsible for. I mean, the car industry and creating the supply chain because there's a need and there's an obvious activity. Again, as we look at the regulation that's coming and as we look at the security posture that needs to get tighter in many critical infrastructure types of businesses, there's a strategy in how you engage in open source to make that as efficient and as effective as possible, right? And those are new things, so it's an evolution, like what we were doing in the early 2000s, Stormy, from an open source standpoint. That's we were leading the path, I think, in many ways. And certainly from having conversations that I had, I expect you had the same types of conversations where, yeah, HP was somewhat of an early leader in that activity with the open source review board, and then what followed on from behind that. But I don't think there's any shortage of needs for adapting and improving this software supply chain that we now all rely on, and being strategically engaged in it to maximize it for company benefit. And engaging, and I have a strong personal view that engaging is one of the only ways that you really do that. So yeah, I totally agree. It's adapting, right?
And to engage with it securely, like the government, when they look at using open source, that's one of their main concerns. So that's a new, like you were talking about earlier with the vulnerabilities and stuff being one of the main concerns these days for people using open source software.
Before we depart, Stormy, can you please tell us something about yourself that has nothing to do with tech, nothing to do with open source, some kind of a hobby or fun fact that you don't mind sharing?
I have one I was going to share that I would share, but I also thought, going back to our conversation about being the only whatever in the room, I have been the only white kid in the village. I have been the only woman in the room, so I have a lot of those I could share. But the fun fact I wanted to share is I give historical tours of the French Quarter in New Orleans, and I think this builds on a lot of, even though it doesn't seem like it, builds on a lot of the career skills I've built. But I take groups of visitors to New Orleans around the French Quarter and tell them about the history of New Orleans and how it came to be and why the buildings are the way they are, and just, and it's a fascinating city with a history unlike any other in Europe or the United States. And on next Monday, I get to give a tour to a bunch of high school students, which should be very interesting.
Nice.
That's amazing. I love that. I should hit you up when I go to New Orleans the next time. I've only had a really short trip there, and I wish someone was taking me around to tell me about the history a little bit. I love it.
Yeah, we can do the tour by day and the jazz and the jazz festival at night. That would be splendid.
This weekend is French Quarter Festival, but New Orleans was in 1 year ended up being French and Spanish and American all within a single year, are controlled by those governments. So it really has a unique history.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
And with that, that's all, folks. That was our episode for today. We want to hear from you. Please leave comments under the episodes that you watched. Share your feedback and share your experiences to continue the conversation. And let us know what topics you would like to hear next. Stay tuned because the next episode is just around the corner.